Imagine holding the fate of an entire civilization in your hands. Today, on The Explainer, we're unpacking one of the most profound, fiercely debated moments in early Islamic history. We are talking about a crossroad where the trajectory of millions literally hung in the balance, all coming down to a single choice made by one man. We're looking at Al-Hasan ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, and his monumental decision right in the middle of an intense, devastating civil war. Let's just dive right into the history and see exactly how this unfolded.
Sometimes, the greatest victory is not defeating an opponent, but preventing a tragedy. I want you to keep this thought right at the front of your mind as we go through this explainer. Because, we normally measure historical greatness by the battles won, the territories conquered, and the enemies completely crushed. But what does it mean to actively choose peace, especially when you know it's going to cost you ultimate political power?
Part 1. The First Fitna. A community divided. Okay, let's quickly set the scene. The 7th century Islamic community was going through a fracturing, deeply violent period of internal division. It was completely unprecedented.
And the pressure on Al-Hasan during this time was absolutely immense. Chronologically, things were moving at a literal breakneck pace. So the first fitna kicks off in 656 AD. Fast forward to January of 661, Al-Hasan's father Ali is tragically assassinated, and Al-Hasan is acknowledged as caliph in Kufa. But by mid-661, his rival Muawiyah is already marching a massive army right toward him, and if that wasn't enough, by August, Al-Hasan is dealing with a full-blown mutiny from his own troops. The man barely had a second to mourn his father, let alone consolidate a totally fractured empire.
Part 2. Confronting Muawiyah I, a crisis of power. This brings us face to face with the primary conflict of our story. Al-Hasan is up against Muawiyah I, the incredibly powerful governor of Syria. And the sheer scale of the threat here was staggering. Muawiyah commanded a highly organized army of 60,000 men. He flat out refused to recognize Al-Hasan's sovereignty and was more than prepared to use overwhelming military force to take the caliphate.
But here's the really wild part. It wasn't just this massive external threat. It was an internal collapse that really forced Al-Hasan's hand. His own defenses were crumbling from the inside out. First, he actually survives a brutal assassination attempt by a Kharijite who literally stabs him in his own camp. Obviously, this completely demoralized his already exhausted army. On top of that, Muawiyah is waging intense psychological and diplomatic warfare. He successfully bribed key commanders in Al-Hasan's vanguard, guys like Ubaydullah, sparking mass defections. So Al-Hasan had to take a hard, objective look at this collapsing military support and make a choice.
Part 3. The Wisdom of Peace. A monumental decision. Facing a vastly superior enemy and an army that was disintegrating before his eyes, Al-Hasan had to find a way out of an endless, bloody civil war. It took an incredible amount of moral courage to choose reconciliation and prioritize communities that were desperately hoping for stability.
Now, hostile critics at the time absolutely called this abdication a sign of weakness. But modern historians and a vast majority of Islamic scholars, they see this as an absolute masterclass in statesmanship. Al-Hasan sacrificed his own political power and personal ambition because he prioritized preventing bloodshed and preserving Islamic unity. He knew for a fact that fighting would only annihilate his most loyal followers and permanently tear the community apart.
When others saw conflict, Al-Hasan saw the possibility of peace. It's so important to realize this wasn't just a surrender. It was a highly calculated diplomatic negotiation. Muawiyah actually sent envoys offering Al-Hasan what was essentially a carte blanche, a blank check to dictate his own terms for stepping down. And Al-Hasan used this exact opportunity to secure protections for his people and leave a lasting, positive impact on Muslim history.
Part 4. Terms of the treaty. Forging a ceasefire. Let's break down how this actually materialized into the formal stipulations signed in August of 661, because this is easily one of the most heavily analyzed pieces of early Islamic diplomacy.
What's really brilliant about these terms is how he utilized his leverage. First, Muawiyah had to rule strictly according to the Quran and the Sunnah. Second, Muawiyah was strictly forbidden from appointing his own successor. The choice had to be decided by a council, or the power would return to Al-Hasan. Third, blanket amnesty and guaranteed safety for all of Al-Hasan's supporters. And finally, a complete end to the state-sponsored public cursing of his father, Ali. Notice how he used his position not to grab personal wealth, but to protect his community's physical and spiritual safety.
Now, to be completely impartial, while the sources all agree on those core peace terms, the financial settlements of the treaty remain highly debated among early historians. For instance, some sources, like Al-Tabari, claim Al-Hasan requested 5 million dirhams directly from the Kufa treasury, but other historians, like Jaffrey and Modeling, strongly reject that, pointing out the treasury was already under Al-Hasan's control and was basically emptied out regularly for the public anyway. There's also a whole debate about whether he was promised tax revenues from Persian districts like Dar-Jabird. It's a really fascinating historical discrepancy that scholars are still trying to untangle today.
Part 5. Character, Generosity, and Faith. The man behind the peace. Stepping away from the intense politics for a moment, let's look at the man himself. Following the treaty, Al-Hasan retired quietly to Medina. He totally stepped away from any political uprisings and instead completely dedicated his time to worship, reflection, and teaching.
Take the number 3, for example. This is honestly incredible. Historical sources tell us that exactly 3 separate times in his life, Al-Hasan looked at everything he owned, literally his entire total wealth, and gave exactly half of it away to charity. Just think about the level of detachment and profound generosity it takes to do that.
And here is another number for you: 10,000. There's this beautiful anecdote in the sources where Al-Hasan was near the Kaaba and he simply overheard a man praying, begging for relief from a crushing 10,000 dirham debt. Al-Hasan didn't go up and introduce himself. He didn't make a big public scene. He just went straight home, gathered the 10,000 dirhams, and immediately gave it to the man to clear his burden.
His character earned admiration even among those who disagreed with him. Because of quiet actions exactly like that, his humility won over even his harshest critics. A perfect example is Marwan bin Hakam, who was Muawiyah's governor in Medina and a massive political rival of Al-Hasan's. Yet at Al-Hasan's funeral, Marwan was right there mourning. When somebody asked him why, Marwan literally pointed to a nearby mountain and said Al-Hasan's forbearance and patience were heavier and stronger than that mountain.
There is also an amazing story that beautifully captures his real-time application of Islamic ethics. One day, a servant accidentally dropped a mug, breaking it. Terrified she was going to be reprimanded, the servant immediately quoted a verse from the Quran about those who restrain their anger. Al-Hasan calmly replied, "I restrain my anger." Then the servant continued the verse, mentioning those who forgive people. Al-Hasan said, "I forgive you." So the servant finished the verse, and Allah loves the doers of good. Al-Hasan immediately replied, "You are free." Just a stunning example of his immediate compassion and forgiveness.
Part 6. Historical Legacy. The End of an Era. Sadly, his quiet life of teaching and reflection in Medina was cut short. Al-Hasan passed away in Medina in 669 or 670 AD. He was only 45 years old. Which brings up a massive historical mystery. Was it a peaceful passing, or was it poison? Now, a few experts don't completely rule out a sudden illness, but the early historical sources are nearly unanimous that Al-Hasan was poisoned. The widely held historical view is that this assassination was orchestrated to remove him as an obstacle, paving the way for Muawiyah to appoint his own son, Yazid, as the next caliph, which, as we know, directly violated the peace treaty they had signed.
Fascinatingly, modern medical historians have actually jumped into this debate, proposing a hypothesis of calomel intoxication to explain his reported symptoms, specifically mercury eye chloride. The sources point out that there were considerable calomel-containing mercury mines in the Byzantine Empire at the time. Plus, some historical reports even explicitly mention a poisoned drink being sourced directly from the Byzantine emperor specifically for this plot.
But regardless of exactly how he died, his legacy is deeply revered across the entire Islamic spectrum. In Sunni traditions, his treaty is viewed as fulfilling a specific prophecy made by the Prophet Muhammad, that he would unite two warring factions of Muslims, and his reign is viewed as the beautiful culmination of the 30 years of rightly guided caliphs. Meanwhile, in Shia theology, as the infallible second imam, his decision is seen as a divinely guided, absolutely necessary ceasefire, or taqiyya, protecting the faithful from total annihilation against an overwhelming force. Both traditions uniquely honor his ultimate sacrifice for peace.
Which brings us right back to our very first thought. Al-Hasan gave up the absolute highest seat of power in his world simply to save lives. So if the ultimate victory is indeed preventing tragedy, how will history measure the leaders of today? It's a profound question about the true nature of statesmanship, power, and ego. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.